If I told you that the most valuable superhero in human history exists entirely because of a series of terrible decisions, would you believe me? Think about it. We're used to seeing Spider-Man everywhere. He dominates box offices, fills toy aisles, and shapes global pop culture. It feels like his success was inevitable, like some room full of corporate geniuses calculated exactly how to build a masterpiece. But that is a lie. Spider-Man wasn't supposed to succeed. Marvel didn't believe in him. Hollywood openly rejected him. Sony almost lost him. Disney still doesn't fully own him. And yet, somehow, every single mistake, every desperate corporate gamble, and every massive disaster only made him bigger. His entire history is a comedy of errors, a story of people saying no, of companies going broke, and of creative desperation hitting at exactly the right second. This isn't a story about a character changing cinema. This is a story about how entertainment history's biggest icon was born entirely by accident. To understand why Spider-Man shouldn't even exist, we have to travel back to 1962. Back then, comic books weren't viewed as modern mythology. They were cheap, disposable entertainment for kids, and the rules of what made a superhero were completely set in stone. A superhero was supposed to be a flawless god. Think Superman or Batman. They were square-jawed, perfectly confident, and didn't have to worry about a day job. If you were a teenager in a comic book in 1962, you had exactly one role: be the sidekick. You carried the flashlight, you got captured by the villain, and you let the grown-ups do the real work. You were Robin or Bucky. You were secondary. Then, a writer named Stan Lee watched a fly crawling up a wall in his office. He got an idea. What if there was a hero who could stick to surfaces? What if he was a teenager, but not a sidekick? What if he was the actual star? And what if, on top of fighting crime, he was constantly stressed out by real-life problems? Stan Lee took this pitch to his publisher, a guy named Martin Goodman. And Goodman's response is arguably the most ironic rejection in the history of media. He looked at Stan and gave him 3 very specific reasons why the idea was terrible. First, people hate spiders, they're creepy. Second, teenagers can't be the lead heroes, they don't have the authority. Third, he has way too many personal problems. Audiences want glamour and escapism, Stan. They don't want to read about a kid struggling to pay his rent or getting rejected by goals. Goodman told him the project was completely dead. Now, in any normal corporate environment, that would be the end of it. The sketch goes in a drawer and we never hear about Peter Parker. But Spider-Man's first stroke of luck wasn't a stroke of creative genius. It was a corporate funeral. Marvel was currently cancelling a failing anthology comic called Amazing Adult Fantasy. They were shortening the name to Amazing Fantasy for its very last issue, issue 15, before shutting it down completely. Because the magazine was already dead, Goodman didn't care what went into the pages. It was a ghost ship. So, Stan Lee snuck his spider hero into that final issue just to get the idea out of his system. It was pure creative defiance disguised as corporate house cleaning. They printed the comic, closed the magazine, and completely forgot about it. They basically threw Spider-Man in the trash. But a few months later, the sales numbers came back. Amazing Fantasy number 15 hadn't just sold well. It was the single highest selling comic book Marvel had put out that entire year. The Dead magazine became a massive hit because kids went crazy for the weird kid on the cover. Goodman panicked, ran back into Stan Lee's office, and demanded they start a standalone series immediately. Spider-Man didn't launch because of a brilliant corporate master plan. He launched because a dying magazine had absolutely nothing left to lose. But this weird pattern, success being born from the ashes of a corporate disaster, wasn't a one-time fluke. It became the character's defining genetic trait. For the next 30 years, Spider-Man carried Marvel on his back. Until 1996, when the money completely ran out. In the mid-90s, the comic book industry collapsed. The collector bubble burst and Marvel's sales plummeted by 70%. Drowning in hundreds of millions of dollars of debt, Marvel officially filed for bankruptcy. The company was literally facing extinction. To keep the lights on, they had to start selling off their own organs. They started carving up their universe and selling the movie rights to Hollywood studios for dirt cheap. They tried shopping around Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America, but Hollywood executives thought they were C-list nobodies. The only character anyone actually cared about was Spider-Man. In 1998, Marvel was so desperate for liquid cash that they approached Sony Pictures with a massive deal. They offered Sony the movie rights to almost every single Marvel character, including Iron Man, Thor, Black Panther, and the Avengers, for a total of just $25 million. Sony's executives looked at the offer, and according to reports, one of the top decision makers literally said, "Nobody gives a shit about the other Marvel characters. We only want Spider-Man." So, Sony rejected the rest of the universe. They bought Peter Parker all by himself for $10 million, leaving the rest of the Marvel roster behind. It was a decision driven by Marvel's absolute desperation and Sony's extreme corporate tunnel vision. Sony walked away laughing, convinced they had just stripped a dying comic company of its only real asset. Marvel walked away with just enough cash to survive another year, but they were missing their greatest icon. Neither side had any clue that they had just set the fuse for the biggest industrial war in modern cinema. So Sony has Spider-Man, and they immediately prove their point. In 2002, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man hits theaters and shatters every box office record in existence. It changes how Hollywood views superhero movies forever. Suddenly, Peter Parker is a multi-billion-dollar cinematic goldmine. But back at Marvel, things are awkward. They are watching Sony make billions off their flagship character while they are sitting on a pile of leftover heroes that Hollywood told them nobody cared about. And this is where the next massive accident happens. Marvel realizes that if they want to make real movie money, they have to produce the films themselves. But because they sold off Spider-Man to Sony and the X-Men to Fox, they are forced to look at the bottom of the barrel. They have to build a movie studio using the exact characters Sony rejected: Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, the biggest franchise in movie history, was not born out of a desire to innovate. It was born because Marvel was backed into a corner. If Marvel had owned Spider-Man in 2008, Iron Man would have never been made. They would have just made a standard Spider-Man movie. The MCU only exists because Marvel didn't have their best player, forcing them to turn their backups into superstars. Meanwhile, over at Sony, things start going south. After Sam Raimi's trilogy, they reboot the franchise with The Amazing Spider-Man. It does okay, but it's not hitting the cultural heights of the original. Then, they put out The Amazing Spider-Man 2 in 2014 and the wheels completely fall off. The movie is a bloated mess because Sony tries to rush their own cinematic universe to compete with Marvel. It underperforms, fans are furious, and Sony is stuck. By law, if Sony doesn't make a Spider-Man movie every few years, the rights automatically revert back to Marvel for free. They can't stop making them, but they don't know how to fix them. They are trapped by their own prize asset. And that brings us to the infamous 2014 Sony hack. Thousands of internal emails are leaked to the public, exposing Hollywood's private panic. And tucked away in those leaks is a wild revelation. Sony had secretly been talking to Marvel Studios about an unprecedented custody battle. Marvel, now backed by Disney's billions, wants their boy back. Sony, humiliated by their recent creative failure, needs a win. So they strike a deal that should be impossible under modern corporate capitalism. Disney and Sony agree to share the character. Sony keeps the rights and finances the solo films, but Marvel Studios gets to creatively produce them and integrate Peter Parker into the MCU. It is a bizarre, fragile alliance between two ruthless corporate rivals. For a few years, it works beautifully. Tom Holland's Spider-Man debuts in Captain America: Civil War, and the fans lose their minds. He anchors Avengers, Infinity War, and Endgame. He becomes the emotional core of the post-Iron Man MCU until 2019, when greed threatens to ruin everything again. After Spider-Man, Far From Home makes over $1 billion, Disney wants a bigger piece of the financial pie. Sony says no. The negotiations completely break down. Suddenly, headlines hit the web. Spider-Man is leaving the MCU. The internet melts down. Fans start boycotting Sony. Even Tom Holland gets involved, reportedly making emotional phone calls to corporate executives while having a few drinks at a pub, begging them to fix it. Once again, public backlash and sheer corporate panic force them back to the table. They patch up the deal, and that chaotic near disaster leads directly to Spider-Man: No Way Home, a movie that leans entirely into the chaos by bringing back Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield. It makes $1.9 billion. But while the live-action world was fighting over contracts, another accidental masterpiece was brewing in Sony's animation department. Around 2014, Sony executives knew they couldn't compete with the traditional MCU formula. They needed a spin-off, something different, so they hired Phil Lord and Chris Miller to develop an animated Spider-Man project. Sony thought they were just making a safe, mid-budget companion piece to keep the brand alive. They basically left the filmmakers alone because all the executive focus was on the live-action drama. Because the studio wasn't micromanaging them, the creative team did something radical. They threw out the traditional rules of animation. They invented a totally new visual style that blended hand-drawn comic art with 3D tech, and they focused the story on Miles Morales. The result was Spider-Man: Into the Spider-Verse. It didn't just win an Academy Award, it fundamentally changed the entire animation industry. Every major studio spent the next 5 years trying to copy its style. Look at the pattern. Every single peak of Spider-Man's cinematic history didn't come from smooth sailing. The MCU crossover happened because Sony failed with Amazing Spider-Man 2. No Way Home happened because a corporate contract fell apart. The Spider-Verse happened because Sony gave up on competing with live action. Disaster is Spider-Man's creative fuel, but all of this corporate drama raises a much deeper question. Why? Why do these multi-billion-dollar empires fight so hard over this specific kid from Queens? Why is he completely irreplaceable? If you ask a casual fan, they'll give you the standard answer: Spider-Man is relatable. But let's look past the surface. Why is he relatable? It's not just an emotional trick, it's built directly into the structural DNA of how the character is written. Think about almost every other major superhero. They are defined by their identity. Batman looks at the camera and says, "I'm Batman." That is his core state of being. Bruce Wayne is just the mask he wears. Superman is an alien god. Tony Stark is a billionaire genius. Spider-Man is the exact opposite. He isn't defined by an identity. He is defined by a constant, overwhelming conflict. Peter Parker doesn't look at the world and say, "I'm Spider-Man." He looks at his watch and says, "I'm late. I'm completely broke. I missed my final exam. I can't pay my rent. My aunt's health insurance is failing. My boss hates my guts." Notice something about that list? Peter Parker is almost never fighting supervillains. He is fighting adulthood. Spider-Man isn't a power fantasy. He is an anxiety simulator. When Tony Stark flies around in a high-tech suit, we get to imagine what it feels like to have unlimited power and wealth. But when Peter Parker is swinging through New York, he's actively worrying about whether he's going to get fired from his delivery job. Having superpowers doesn't fix a single one of Peter's real-world problems. In fact, it makes them significantly worse. If he stays up late saving the city from a rampaging rhino, he sleeps through his alarm, misses his shift, and can't afford groceries the next morning. His heroism actively sabotages his survival. And that brings us to the rawest, most human truth about the character. Spider-Man is the ultimate loser. I mean that in the most respectful way possible. Most superheroes exist to save the world. They win the day, they get the medal, and they fly off into the sunset. Spider-Man barely saves his own life. Think about what Peter Parker loses over the course of his story. He loses Uncle Ben, he loses Gwen Stacy. In many versions, he loses Aunt May. He loses his best friend, his financial stability, his privacy, his relationships, and his literal future. In No Way Home, the ultimate victory of the movie requires him to sacrifice his entire identity. He forces the universe to forget he ever existed, leaving him completely alone in a tiny empty apartment with nothing but a sewing machine. He gives up everything and the world doesn't even know to thank him. We don't root for Spider-Man because he's strong or because he has cool quips or because his suit looks great. We root for him because he gets absolutely destroyed by life, and the next morning, he still chooses to put the mask back on and swing out the window. He represents the daily grind of just trying to keep your head above water. It's easy to look back at the last 60 years and say that Spider-Man changed Hollywood. But the truth is much bigger than that. Think about the sheer visual history of this character. We've seen a brilliant trilogy in the early 2000s. We've seen a gritty, tech-focused reboot. We've seen a high-tech, high school trilogy inside a massive cinematic universe. We've seen him split into a beautiful, multi-dimensional animated web of different characters. We've seen different faces, different suits, entirely different universes, but somehow, it's always the exact same kid. Because Spider-Man was never really about Peter Parker. The radioactive spider bite isn't the core of the story. Spider-Man is an exact metaphor for that specific, terrifying moment in everyone's life, when responsibility arrives long before you are actually ready for it. It's that moment when you realize nobody is coming to save you, and you have to figure out how to grow up on your own. That's why he survives every corporate war. That's why he outlives every single reboot, every bad executive decision, and every contract dispute. Because Hollywood can buy and sell the rights all day long, but none of us ever truly stop becoming Spider-Man. If you appreciate storytelling that goes past the surface, hit subscribe for more deep dives into film and cinema-related content. I'll see you in the next video.